Hello, everyone, and thanks a lot for joining today. So, we have Dr. Robin with us and Dr. Umesh.
I'm looking at this Word document here, and I have a question on the assignment that was about measuring bird populations and communities, which is on a point count, the abundance of birds at different equally spaced radial distances is assumed to, and there were four options. The correct answer is to increase linearly. Um, the question is if the abundance of birds at different equally spaced radial distance means at each point we select to sample birds like P1, P2, P3, which are random points out of the grid, then the assumption is that the abundance of birds is uniform. That is the basis of the point count. The assumption that the of bird distributions being random or uniform is definitely an assumption of both the line transect and the point count forms of sampling, but that is the distribution of birds in the habitat as a whole. Uh, at a point, if you look at different radial distances, because the area of those circles increases linearly, because the assumption is one of random or uniform distribution of birds in the habitat, because the area of those circles moving away from the point increases linearly, therefore the abundance of birds should also increase linearly as you move away from the point. So the it is a tricky concept. It's a little difficult to grasp in the beginning. But if you go back to the recording and you look at the green and yellow bar graphs, the green showing you how the actual abundance of birds is increasing or remaining uniform, increasing in the case of a point count linearly, and remaining the same in case of a line transect with increasing distance from the point, then basically you're seeing that the actual abundance of birds at different distances from the points does increase linearly just because the area of the
Ye-
circles that
Sir,
are being
excuse me, your voice is very
point
low.
increases linearly. Um, there's a second question, which is there a conditional prerequisite for the relationship between individual bird numbers and bird species, which is as individual bird numbers increase, number of species increase to be true. We come across, the reason for this question is that we come across large numbers of rock pigeons or common crows in an urban setting, but it wouldn't follow the set relationship. Same for the flock of flamingos or water birds. Although individual numbers are high, species numbers are not. That's a great question. The reason is it depends on the kind of community that you're studying. So if you have an urban community where you have certain very common species, you have like crows, for example, and then you have a large number of rarer species, and you compare that to a rainforest community where you tend not to have one or two dominant species, but the number of individuals or the abundances of these species are more even than in an urban setting. Then it's true that if you have only one flock and all of them is made up of crows, then if you add more individuals to your sample, you're actually not adding species. But that's often not the case when we encounter, simply the sampling process is such that if you sample more individuals, you are likely to add more species up to a certain point. That point is when you have sampled all the species in the community. So my first sample of an individual, the first individual I see will belong to one particular species. If the uh, if the community is not very even, if you have a dominant species that is very common, then the second individual sampled will also be from the same species. So you're not adding a new species. But if the community is more even in that the population sizes of various species is more even and you don't have these dominants, then it's very likely that the second individualized sample might belong to a different species. And so on and so forth. You keep adding the third and the fourth and the fifth individual. And the number of species will rise initially quite fast and then start peaking and then plateau. And it will plateau when you have sampled all the species in the community. So generally, when we're sampling species, it depends on the level of evenness and dominance of different species in the community, how fast or how slowly you add new species with new individuals. There's a third question on the macroecology lecture, which is, does the larger range size of birds in temperate zones have to do with there being more long distance migrants in these regions, or is it only the breeding range of the migrants that is being considered? It's actually only the breeding range of these migrants is being considered. It's not because they are migrants that they have large range sizes. If you only look at the breeding ranges of these migrants as well, those ranges are much larger in temperate areas than in tropical areas. The reason for this is thought to be that birds in temperate areas, or generally species in temperate areas, are more generalist. They're temperature generalists. They're able to deal with cold temperatures. They're able to deal with relatively warm temperatures as well, relatively warm temperatures compared to the tropics. And so, because they're able to deal with a wide variety of climatic conditions, they're also able to occupy large ranges, because anywhere in that large range is will have climatic conditions that they're able to adapt to and occupy. So it's only the breeding season ranges that we're talking about here when we're talking about temperate birds, and not the overall range, including breeding and winter. So I have a question here, which is, it just says, I have 3 queries regarding this. If island 1 was larger and farther than what is observed, also what is larger versus smaller relatively, and how many species diversity are we talking about, maybe relative? So, okay. So this is island biogeography, yes. If island 1, so the number of species on an island is a trade-off between the size of the island and the isolation, or the distance of the island from the mainland. So if you had a large island close to the mainland, it would have a certain number of species. A same sized island further away from the mainland will have a lower number of species. And when we're talking about species diversity and how many species, it all depends on a variety of factors, whether the islands are tropical or temperate, what is the distribution of those islands in space, what is the relationship, proximity wise to the mainland and so on. So there's no one answer for this in terms of either. The second question is, what is larger versus smaller? It's just relative to each other, right? So a larger island is an island that is just larger than the other islands. There's no particular size that cutoff that determines whether an island is large or small. And again, species diversity in island biogeography is also, there's no one answer about what is a diverse island or what is a less diverse island. It all depends on a variety of other factors. So, how many species are we talking about? Depends on, the Japanese archipelago might have a very different number of species in their islands than the Galapagos, for example. The Galapagos is very, very far away from the mainland. It's in the middle of the Pacific, so it's quite isolated. And so you have a lower number of species for the same island size than you might have in Japan, for example, where a Japanese island, which is very, very close to Eastern Asia, the Eastern Asian mainland, those islands are likely to have more species than the Galapagos. Okay, I think the other questions on this document are for Robin, but let me just check the chat box in case I have any questions for myself. I have one last question for me, and then I hand it over to Robin because the other questions are for him. This is a question about the capture-recapture formula to calculate population. The formula is probably applicable only if all variables are non-null. Mr. Anand, could you please elaborate on what you mean by non-null? I'm not sure I understand that. So you have one variable which is unknown, that is n, which is the actual population size. You have the number of captures in the first occasion. You have the number of captures in the second occasion, m and n. And then you have the number of recaptures in the second occasion, which is r. When you say m, n, and r are non-null, what do you mean by that? Could you please elaborate? If any variable is zero, right? Okay, then the population will show as infinity. So obviously, if the number of captures and the number of recaptures is the number of captures in the first occasion and the number of captures on the second occasion is zero, then we can't even estimate population size. If the number of recaptures is zero, then it could be either of two things. One is that you've gone back on the second occasion and sampled at such a point in time that none of the initial birds that were captured in the first occasion are present in the population anymore. They're either died or they've moved away. And so the number of recaptures you get in the second occasion will be zero. That is what is called an open population, where you're allowing the population to change over time. In the case of the formula mn divided by r, what we're assuming is a closed population, which means that the population is not allowed to vary over time. The number of individuals remains the same. There are no individuals coming in from outside. There are no individuals being born. There are no individuals dying or individuals leaving that area. So the second period of second capture occasion has to be close enough to the first capture occasion such that the assumption that the population is closed is not violated. And if that assumption is not violated, then you will get recaptures in your second sampling occasion as well. The other possibility is that of not getting recaptures, let's say you are assuming a closed population and the population has not changed over time and you have marked a certain number of individuals in the first occasion and you're still not getting recaptures in the second occasion, then that could be an issue of sampling effort. Maybe the amount of effort that you have put in terms of the number of mist nets that are being put in, the number of hours that those mist nets are being operated is low, and so that could also be an issue of the amount of sampling effort that's being put in. So the key thing to remember in this issue of close population size estimation is that the sampling occasions should be close enough to each other to ensure that the assumption of demographic closure, which means that the population is not changing, is not violated. One other question from Anirudh is what are the reasons for birds in the temperate regions to be generalist compared to those in the tropics? So if you look at seasonality or just temperature variability in temperate areas, the temperate areas are far more seasonal, far more variable over the annual period in temperature. So the summers can go up, 35, 36 degrees Celsius, and the winters can go down to, minus 30, minus 40 degrees Celsius. So you're talking about an 80 degrees Celsius range in annual temperature variability in temperate areas. 75 to 80 degrees Celsius difference between winter and summer. Whereas if you come to the tropical areas, then there is not that much variability. If you go to, say, Indonesia, and you look at winter temperatures, large parts of the tropics don't have a clear winter or a summer. But if you look at the equator, for example, the variability in temperature is very, very low. From the coldest period of the year to the warmest period of the year, temperature variability might be, 6, 7, 8 degrees Celsius. So birds that are in temperate areas and resident there will have to have evolved to be able to deal with these wide fluctuations in temperature over the years, over the course of the year. Whereas birds in tropical areas simply do not face that massive variation in temperature. And so they tend to be specialists because they don't need to evolve that generalized temperature tolerances, and that's the reason for which it's an evolutionary reason why temperate birds are special generalists, because they have evolved to be able to deal with that seasonality, whereas tropical birds are specialists because they simply do not have to deal with the kind of seasonality that is there in temperate areas. I think that is all. Those are all the questions I have for myself. Um, Robin, do you want to take over? You're mute.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes,
All
Robin, we
right,
can hear you.
excellent. Yeah, thank you. So I'll just start with the most recent question, which is on the chat box. There was one on, the context of the term dispersal. I think that is a really good question because, Umesh was just talking about migration, and then there is dispersal. So the question is, basically both are movement, but there is a characteristic difference between these two. Migration is a seasonal movement where the entire population moves from one area to another because the environment changes. But dispersal is a demographic thing. So not the entire population, but some individuals move out. And this happens, there is something called natal dispersal. So as the young kind of, grow up, let's say, they move somewhere and they find their own territories. So, so that is the difference between dispersal and migration. And you're right that dispersal has nothing to do with migration per se. Yeah. Uh, I hope that clears the question that K Art was asking. Yeah, what time periods are we talking about? So that because it's a demographic thing, dispersal, that happens at different stages of an animal's life. It's not an annual event like migration, which happens through the organism's life. It's a seasonal movement, but dispersal happens only in some particular, especially natal dispersal, happens only in some stages of organism's life. So I hope that's clear. Um, yeah, there are some other questions that are there. Um, uh, uh, there's a question from Vardhana on the form. But I think that's the same question. I think that's the same question that Gaia had. Yeah. And that's about the physical barrier about Park Strait and Sri Lanka and things like that. So I think one thing that so I find that there are two kinds of questions that people have been having about biogeography. One is about just getting really confused about this emigration, immigration, and the number of species, extinction, and colonization. And I think that I can keep explaining it, but the real way to figure that out is do that simulation that I had sent. It's very simple. You can do it on a phone. You basically play around with the size of an island, do the simulation, and see what happens. So that is one. The other is I'm not saying I won't engage, but like do that exercise, come back, and then we can engage further. So that's like a little bit more nuanced engagement that happens. Another is about relic species and so on. Again, about this, I posted I think there is a response on the discussion thread with a link to an article. I mean, you don't have to understand all the words in the article, I mean, the main thing that you have to understand is how that there is something, how do you identify a relic? And increasingly, people are doing that with phylogenetic data. And that there is a visualization, there's a figure there. Just follow the figure, you'll understand what that means. Um, yeah, basically, so there are no other relatives, everything else has gone extinct. What it means about the age of the habitat and things like that, I mean, that's more complicated. So it can be that the habitat that a relict is in is also old, but that's not necessary, as that article actually points out very nicely. So do take a look at that article, and that would kind of clarify the relict idea. Uh, so let me see. The Sri Lanka. Yeah, the question. So there was another thread of questions that was about barriers. Okay, so I think that barriers. The thing about barriers is that it's relative, and I know how annoying this can be. For people who are used to defining things in very absolute terms. But that is, in some ways, the challenge with ecology, and that's why many of us like doing ecological research, because it's not it's not that straightforward. Everything depends. It depends on something. So in this case, the barrier depends on the organism. It depends on certain location. So you can't say that 10 kilometers is always a barrier between a mountain. That may depend on where that 10-kilometer barrier is. For example, in tropical coastal mountains, they tend to accumulate a lot of cloud. So you have these cloud forests, and then barrier can be just a drop in that elevation from where that cloud presence is found. So, that is actually a very relative thing, because a drop in elevation may seem very small. The distance between the mountains may seem very small, and this is exactly what happens, in those examples, Chenkuta Gap and so on. That's very interesting. And Goa Gap, it's not even a real gap actually. So this is just it's a climatic barrier. Again, there's a paper that is shared on the discussion group, which is more bird related. Uh, what's happening is that the climatic regime north of that imaginary line seems to be different, and to the south it's different. At least that's what we suggested early on. But since then, there are other researchers. For example, there's a recent paper, I think it's this year, that talks about the height of the trees. And they actually use remotely sensed tree height data from all of areas north of the Goa Gap and then the south of the Goa Gap. And they say that the trees are actually shorter north of the Goa Gap. And then they go on to propose that it is a consequence of this difference in tree height that organisms like the Draco, which is this gliding lizard, is not found north of the Goa Gap, but it's found to the south. Um, so what I'm trying to say is that what is a barrier for one may not be a barrier for the other. It depends on the organism. It depends on the extent of specialization that that organism has to whatever is being, you know, uh, barriered or whatever, how you want to say it. But the point is that it's not very easy to say. But the principle, the idea is the same. It's about how far you can or you will disperse. Um, yeah, and the Sri Lanka, is very similar. So Sri Lanka was always attached to India. It's just that the sea level kept going up and down. Yeah. What I'll do is, I think there's a very nice animation. I mean, it's not just an animation; it's an interactive tool where you can slide the time bar, and it shows you what the sea levels were in the past. And I think that's really great, because you'll see that Sri Lanka and India have had constant, separation and connections. And obviously, what happens when you have connection is that organisms move across. And then when they're separated, they're isolated. So they tend to differentiate. And how soon those events happen and how dramatically it impacts some species, that then results in, speciation and things like that. It completely depends on the taxa in question. Yeah, I think that. Are there any other questions that are there? I don't know, Devika or Jobin, if I have missed anything.
Robin, I think there might be some questions in the chat box on
Yeah, there
continental
are a few
drift
questions
and
for Robin on
Palghar
the
line.
chat box. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know where to go from. So that's an exam question. Whatever you all are teaching, from there only questions are going to come. Yeah, I think so. But I don't think. I don't think. Yeah, I don't think any of us are going to ask you questions directly from the lectures. If you're thinking of, sitting with the transcript and mugging up terms, I don't think that's going to work. I mean, you have to really think, and that's how most of us, our idea of teaching is in that way. So yeah. Uh, Palghat line is also south of Goa. uh, yeah, I think I just answered that, and yeah, you noted that as well. Uh, yeah, Deepak has a very interesting question about the continental drift and Pangea. Yes, you're very, very, very correct. And there is a very nice website. You should go to this. Yeah, I think that's the spelling. It's the name. It's the name of a scientist, and he has. I mean, his basic goal has been to create uh, these maps, these illustrations of uh, how continental drift has happened. So he has a very nice website where he has simulations of various things. But yeah, I mean, you have to understand this whole thing has happened over several million years, right? Like the Indian plate is just dramatic because it just moved quite a lot. But most of the others are very small changes, and they keep kind of having these breaks. And I think there was a recent story about I think a building or something that was on one of these continental the those lines, and then it was beginning to stretch apart or something like that, and it was a big tourist attraction, and finally it was thought to be not safe anymore for people to visit that. I think if you also Google, you'll find very nice underwater, like these videos of people. Um, um I think it's the Beringia, the Russia and America, that area where a lot of the human migration also happened. That for that area also, there's a lot of people who've been going diving, and they kind of look at those plate boundaries. That's what they're called. So it's fascinating. I mean, that's a whole field in geology. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a specific answer to it, but there are people who study this as a full-time career. So you should look that up. Yeah.
I think I have a couple of questions for me.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of those is on the document. I'm sorry, that doesn't have names. But the question is, in the tropics, temperature variability is minimal and food availability relatively equal during summer and winter. Is this the reason why we do not have birds migrating in the tropics and only in the colder latitudes? Yes, that's certainly one of the hypotheses that has been advanced to explain bird migration, which is that these species that are migrating long distance are actually tracking resource availability. So resources are available. Resources like insects, for example, are available abundantly in summer, in tropical latitudes. And when these resources become scarce during winter, these birds are forced to move to warmer areas where resources are still available. So that's definitely one hypothesis that has a lot of support, that temperate species do migrate because food availability is different throughout the year. In the tropics also, there is a form of migration in tropical mountains that is altitudinal migration. Tropical mountains, like in the Himalayas, for example, the Andes. If you go, there is a relationship between seasonality and elevation. So low elevations are far less seasonal than higher elevations. So at higher elevations, you have warm summers, very cold winters, whereas at lower elevations, the winters are not as harsh. So even in tropical mountains, you do see elevational migration, where birds that breed at high elevation, a large number of species that breed at high elevations actually move down to lower elevations in the winter and then return to breed at high elevations in summer. So it's a much shorter scale movement of birds. It's not the large dramatic latitudinal migration that you see, from, for example, North America to South America, but it's just in within the mountain range from high elevation to low elevations. I think Manjari has a question about. Great, Krishna. Manjari has a question. Is there a correlation between the size of an island and the rate of extinction? I understand both of these are influencing factors in the number of species. Also, does the size of an island take into account surface area? For example, a smaller island with a mountain might have a larger surface area than Manjari, you're absolutely right. The island, I'll just deal with the second question there first, is that the island biogeography theory itself does not make any assumptions about topography and area, right? So you're absolutely right that a small island that is more complex topographically, if it has a mountain on it, will actually have more area. And the classical theory of island biogeography does not really deal with things like this. But if you have two islands that are equal in area when you look at them from above, that let's say they're both this size, and one of them has a mountain and the other one is completely flat, then actually the effective area on the first island will be higher. The number of individuals that it can support will be higher than in the case of the second island. The correlation between the size of an island and the rate of extinction arises from the fact that larger islands are able to support a larger number of individuals. So if you have larger populations, so if you have a large island which can support a large number of individuals, then that population size of that species is also large. And a larger population is less vulnerable to demographic stochasticity. So small populations can go extinct because of demographic stochasticity. And so when you have a small island with small populations, those populations are vulnerable to extinction from demographic stochasticity. If you have large islands with large populations, simply because of the population is large, it is less vulnerable to extinction. And that is the reason why there is a correlation between size of an island and extinction probability on an island. The reason is that larger islands support more individuals, therefore population sizes are higher, and those populations are less vulnerable to extinction because they're not as exposed to demographic stochasticity as smaller populations on small islands. Devika, there's a question on the exam. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So the questions in the exam are going to be mainly multiple choice. I mean, only multiple choice. So yeah. If there are no more questions, should we end the session? A recording of the session will be shared with you in a couple of, hopefully very soon.
Yeah, so somebody said there are follow-up questions. I mean, if you have follow-up questions, you can ask them now, or you can ask it through the forum also. That's not a problem.
Robin, there's a question on the Godavari and it being a paleo river.
Yeah, I mean, so this the idea of actually, I can refer you to other literature also. Uh, So paleo rivers are, I mean, I'm not sure even if that is a technical term, but essentially there are these rivers that have been there for a very long time because they have some geographical feature. Um and at the Godavari area, there has been this, apparently there have been these tilts uh, uh, of the land surface. So at some point, there was a lot of incursion of marine elements coming in as well. I mean, now you know it as a river that flows out, but there was some of the water was coming in, and I think there are fossils that are there of I forget, but I read in the there's a very nice description in the book Indica, and if you're interested in what is called this deep natural history, which means you're looking at everything in a more wholesome kind of way. You're looking at rivers and geographical features and wildlife, along with the Earth's history, so to say. So that is a very nice book that you can get started on. And this describes this also very nicely. I'll just paste this uh, in the, yeah. So that can give you some ideas. Umesh, there's an over dispersion question for you.
Yes, Manjari, yes. Yeah. So what overdispersion is doing is basically measuring the variability of traits in a community. So let's say you have a community of 10 bird species and you're interested in the traits of these birds. And let's say you're interested in the morphology or the structure of the beak of these 10 different bird species. Let's say all of these 10 birds have very, very similar beaks. In that case, functionally, in terms of beak morphology, these birds will be clustered. In this community shows a clustering of functional traits. Whereas if you have a community where you have traits that are very, very different from each other. Let's say each beak of each of those 10 bird species is very, very different from each other. Then the overall space, if you think of it conceptually, the space occupied by beak morphology is very large, and therefore this is an over-dispersed community in terms of beak morphology. The same concept applies also to relatedness of phylogeny, where if you have a bird community of 10 species that are all very, very close to each other, closely related to each other, then that community will be phylogenetically clumped because all those bird species are related to each other. Whereas if you have a community of 10 bird species which are not related to each other, let's say each of those 10 bird species is from a different family, then that community would be phylogenetically over dispersed or less related to each other. So that's what over dispersion means, both in terms of genetics, in terms of relatedness, as well as over dispersion in terms of state space, functional trait space. Deepak has a question on the Jordan's cursor, which is about double jeopardy. So double jeopardy is a situation where a species that is geographically restricted also tends to have small population sizes. So the Jordan's cursor definitely, yes, is geographically restricted to a certain kind of habitat. and the population size is also small, and therefore, yes, it would be vulnerable to both environmental stochasticity and demographic stochasticity. So environmental stochasticity being, let's say there is a sudden drought that affects the range of the Jordan's Coast, that can have an effect on the population of the Jordan's Coast that arises from the fact that the environment is unpredictably variable. And the other issue is demographic stochasticity. So let's say the population size is very small, then random fluctuations in birth rates and death rates can cause the population to go extinct. So I think yes, you're right in saying that the Jordan's Coast could be a case of double jeopardy.
Yeah. Umesh, there's a question for me, which is about the Sholakili and the Palghar Gap. So actually, I was trying to answer this in a more broad way, Sulochana. The thing about the gap and barriers is that it really depends on the species. So let me give you an example. So let's say you have two forest patches, and there is a road going in the middle. Okay. Now, is this something that creates a barrier, or is it connecting something? But that depends on what the organism is. So if it's an organism that lives, it's an open habitat organism, then the road actually may facilitate movement of the species through what would have been otherwise, forest, and it was not able to go through. But now it is able to go through. But on the other hand, if it is, in the two forest patches, then the road may be a barrier. But then that is not so black or white, because it depends on what species it is. Because some species may be able to move across very small divides. Let's say a two-lane road should not be very difficult for a frugivorous bird to navigate. But if it is an 8-lane highway and your species of interest is a frog, then maybe that is going to be a barrier. So what is a barrier actually depends on what species it is, in the sense that where it lives and its ecological, some of those traits. Is it able to move, through this particular kind of habitat or not? So for Sholakili, which is found on the mountain top, Palghar Gap, you have to go down and then go up. The straight line distance is not much, but these birds never fly straight line. So, what they say, as the crow flies, the thing is that mostly only the crows fly that way. The understory birds actually follow the terrain. They follow habitat features and terrain features, which means that they don't fly across the mountain. They have to come down and go up. And for them to come down and go up, they can't do it without the help of the habitat. Which means that they wait for the climate to change. I mean, they wait. I'm just saying all of this in a very superficial manner, but they don't actually wait. But when the climate changes and the gap also has a conducive climate, they are able to move across. But when the climate changes and the wet habitats go up, then they are isolated, and the gap is a barrier. I hope that's clear. And there's also a follow-up question about how the road is a barrier. I think road, it's just simple. I mean, if it causes mortality, or there are different kinds of things. One is that if an organism is simply not able to move across physically, and this is a question a lot of people who don't engage with ecology ask. For example, birds can fly, so why don't they just fly from one place to the other? It's like saying that why don't primates cross across these rainforest fragments? I mean, they do have legs, right? They can just walk across. But the point is, if you're a canopy, upper canopy primate, you just don't come down. That's just a behavioral attribute. You're specialized to that, and that has come as a consequence of, it's a behavioral specialization sometimes, but it's come as a consequence of millions of years of evolution. So you don't just ditch that one day and decide to cross. I mean, so there's a behavioral component as well as a physical limitation component. The physical limitation is if you are a terrestrial organism, and if there is a water body and you can't swim, then that is a physical limitation. But the behavioral components are slightly more complicated. You have to understand the species. Yeah, over to you, Umesh.
Thanks, Robin. I have a follow-up question from Manjari about double jeopardy, which is double jeopardy observed only for populations that are surrounded by barriers or regions that are surrounded by barriers? Again, Robin has been talking about barriers and how barriers that are operating to prevent birds from dispersing from one region to another might not be obvious to us. So we typically, think of barriers like rivers or mountain ranges, or the open ocean as being a barrier. But there could be barriers that are invisible to us. For example, there is this bird species called the Bougainvillea, which is extremely range restricted. It has a 2 square kilometer global range of this bird is 2 square kilometers, and it's there seems to be no reason why the Bougainvillea cannot expand its range beyond those 2 square kilometers. So, but it's not visible to us what those barriers might be. Are those barriers, like Robin is saying, they could be behavioral, they could be interactions with other species. So the concept of the barrier is not particularly a straightforward one. So Manjari, I would say definitely, like a small island, for example, a population on a small island will definitely be subject to double jeopardy. And that's a case of a very clear barrier surrounding the island, which is the ocean that is inhospitable to birds of the terrestrial birds on the island. But there could be cases where the barriers are not particularly apparent, but any geographically restricted population that is small will be subject to double jeopardy, regardless of whether we can see those barriers or not. So it's basically you have a small range size, and within that range size, you have low population density that will subject you to double jeopardy. Yes, Anirudh, actually, Cornell's work on Balanus and Thamellus found that if you remove Thamellus, then Balanus colonizes the entire the tidal range of heights on these tidal pools. Whereas if you remove Balanus, Thamellus actually does not expand. So they looked at that as well. So there is competitive exclusion by Balanus. So Balanus was excluding Thamellus from a part of that site. And if you remove Balanus, then Thamellus would expand its range. But the opposite is not true. So Balanus is basically a superior competitor in this case. It outcompetes and excludes Thamellus from certain parts of the tidal flats. But Thamellus is not as strong a competitor, and removing Thamellus does not actually have an impact. I also have a question on this extreme speciation in species like forest owlet or Bougainvillea, which are not in oceanic islands like the Narcondam hornbills, surrounding habitat and microclimate that drastically different from. So Rishika, this is a question that we've been thinking about for a long time, and it seems as if the surrounding habitat and the microclimate are not that different. And the question is, actually, forest owlet was thought to have a much smaller range than it actually does today. So forest owlet's range is not all that small. But in the case of the Bougainvillea, it seems as if there's no reason why it should not expand to other areas, because the microclimate and the habitats look identical to the naked eye. But there could be something about the biology of the species that just simply is forcing them to be restricted to a small population size. That could be because, let's say, there are other species that are superior competitors. So the Bogoleo chikla is found in this particular habitat, and then other closely related birds that are competing with it for resources are simply not allowing it to expand in its range. So it could be a variety of both abiotic reasons, which is climate microhabitat kind of reasons, as well as biotic interactions that cause this kind of rarity. We do know that competitive interactions are very, very important in structuring communities. So, for example, if you have two species that are very, very closely related on a mountain, they will compete with each other very, very strongly to limit ranges in either the higher or the lower parts of the mountain. So it could be these biotic interactions as well. Krishna has a question on bird dispersion, which could be driven by the need to disperse. If they have all resources and no reason, they might not disperse. That's true, Krishna. Very often what we see, though, is that a habitat for a particular species will be at what is called carrying capacity. So let's say you have a 1 hectare area, or let's say a 1 square kilometer area, and that 1 square kilometer area can support, let's say, 10 individual birds of a particular species, and we're talking about one species at the moment. So 1 square kilometer can support 10 birds, 10 individuals. If there are 8 individuals in the habitat, and in the breeding season 2 more individuals are added, then they can be accommodated on that same in that same area. However, if the carrying capacity is overshot, if you have suddenly now 14 birds on this habitat patch that can only support 10, then either one of two things will happen. Either those extra 4 birds will die because they're outcompeted by better competitors of their own species, or these 4 birds will be forced to move out of that habitat patch and colonize some other area which is below carrying capacity. So bird dispersion is definitely driven by the need to disperse, especially out of habitats that have reached what is called carrying capacity, which is the ability of the habitat to support a certain number of individuals. Robin, I think you have a question, which is Vicarians the same thing as allopatric speciation?
Sorry, I don't see that.
It's in the chat box, Robin, at 453 by Sulochana Kumar. The question is Vicarians the same thing as allopatric speciation?
Well, yeah. Yeah, I guess you could say that, but they are usually used slightly differently, I suppose. So, Umesh, do you have a good answer to that, by the way?
So vicariance is when there is a geographical barrier that causes speciation. Yes. And allopatric speciation is where you have 2 different geographical ranges and where there is no exchange of individuals between those 2 populations. And that's what is causing these populations to diverge and speciate into 2 new species. So I suppose vicariance is one form of allopatric speciation.
That is probably the right way to say it. Yeah, you're right. So vicariance can result in allopatry and allopatric speciation, but that need not be the only form of allopatric speciation. Yeah. Thanks, Umesh. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we are now running out of running out of time.
Yeah, I think if there are any follow-up questions, they can be put on the forum and we'll try our best to answer them as soon as possible.
Yeah. Especially the coalescent theory, I don't think can be answered that easily. So I think that would require a full lecture by itself. But I think there is a little bit of that in one of the lectures coming up. So hold on to that thought. Actually, yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, Rishika. So maybe we'll get back in touch after that lecture. All right.
Right.
So
Thank you all.
Devika.
Great. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Robin. Thanks a lot, Umesh, for taking out time. And thanks a lot to all participants who have joined in.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
See you.
Thanks.
See you. Bye
Bye.
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 Yeah. Bye, Jobin. Thank you.